Senator Van Hollen,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
you've been patient.
Well, we have. We also have the appropriations foreign ops markup going on. But I want to start by just thanking you and Ranking Member Brown for this timely hearing and for your joint determination to make sure that this committee does its part in making sure that we bring what Mr. Zubin described as concerted, massive, and immediate pressure on North Korea, using all the tools at our disposal to do that. And I did have the opportunity over the break to visit South Korea, Japan, and China on a bipartisan delegation that was led by Senator Markey. And in Korea, we went to the DMZ area, but we also traveled up to the North Korea-China border, to the city of Dandong that many have talked about, where you have that cross-border trade between North Korea and China. We thought it was important to go up there and take a look at what was going on and talk to people. And we also had a chance to meet with President Moon, and I just want to assure my colleagues, based on our conversations, that he's determined to address the threat. He is not engaged in appeasement, and I do think it's important that we're all on the same page going forward. He's also deploying the THAAD anti-missile defense system there, despite some concerns in South Korea. And what's troubling to me is that when South Korea is taking these defensive measures to deploy these defensive systems, China has actually imposed an informal embargo on some South Korean consumer goods. They have actively discouraged visits from China to South Korea, which were growing, a big part of the tourism industry. In fact, some estimates suggest that it's dropped by about 40%. And so instead of doing more to work with us in the international community to actually enforce the UN sanctions on North Korea, they are actually penalizing South Korea for deploying the THAAD missile defense system. So as we've all discussed today, it's very important that we find ways to work with China to get them to bring more pressure on North Korea and recognize that the most chaos you would see in terms of a regime in North Korea is if you have military action and a war. And the UN panel of experts last February did a thorough analysis of the trade and commercial interactions with North Korea. And they concluded that the sanctions which were then in place were not being fully complied with, that there were lots of holes in them. And Senator Toomey mentioned this morning the Wall Street Journal article that mentions the fact that this same UN panel of experts is just about to issue an interim report saying that that pattern continues, that the sanctions are not being adequately enforced. And I want to quote from the Wall Street Journal article here. It says, the UN panel, and this is today, the UN panel also named several North Korean banks established, managed, or owned by Chinese companies. Beijing told the panel that the companies are not authorized to establish banks in North Korea, but the panel said it had not heard whether Chinese authorities had acted to shut them down. And that's why Senator Toomey and I and many others on a bipartisan basis believe it's important to take this next step. And that's why we've introduced the BRINK Act. And the idea of the BRINK Act is to model it after the Iran sanctions. Obviously, there's some differences between the situation in Iran and the situation in North Korea. But the idea is to put in place a clear structure of escalating sanctions that will take place. But it also does provide the administration with some flexibility. I want to ask you about that because, first of all, it says let's just name and identify the banks and firms, name and shame that are engaged in trade with North Korea. Do any of you see any problem with publicly identifying, just naming those banks that we have information about if they're evading the sanctions?
And Senator, are you talking about evading U.S. sanctions, or are you talking about evading UN sanctions?
These would be both, whether they're evading UN sanctions, but also if whether that bank is engaged in conduct that evades U.S. sanctions or UN sanctions.
So I think obviously naming and shaming is a tried and true tool in the sanctions toolkit. As such, I wouldn't object to it, no.
Any objections? Yeah. And then it does have an escalating series of choices that the administration can make, right? You don't have to immediately cut off any bank from the financial system. The whole idea is to provide warning and then determine whether or not that bank or financial institution is knowingly violating these provisions, which is why fines are also an option. So I guess, have you had a chance to look at those suite of options within the overall structure? And if we could start with you, Mr. Ruggiero, and then we'll...
Yes, I think that starting with fines, well, starting with identification and then fines, and I think the other interesting part of the bill is the carve out for law enforcement activity, which is also important because I think the law enforcement should have the option to seek cooperation like they did with Chinese telecom ZTE.
Right. No, and I'm glad you mentioned that that piece of it. I see I may have gone over my time. Senator Warner's here. But let me thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here and appreciate your insights.